We are back. We are still reading Black Fortunes, and we are on chapter. We are about to start chapter 6. Let's get it. Freedom and progress. If there be any who are afraid of the rivalry of the black man in office or in business, I have only to advise them to try and beat their competitor. Thaddeus Stevens, 1867. Chapter 6, 40 Acres Deferred. According to lore, on a hot day in June 1865, at the end of the Civil War, a group of Union soldiers on horseback rode into Oklahoma from Texas and convened groups of enslaved African Americans in clearings in the woods and on plantation fields. In the thick, dust-filled summer air, they told the gathering of African Americans that slavery was over. Oklahoma was vast, full of frontier towns, farms, and Indian settlements. More than 5,000 African Americans lived in the territory in bondage. Despite what they may have been told, African Americans in Oklahoma would not be liberated until much later. They had been enslaved not by white men, but by the Indians of the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes who ruled the region. The people of the 5 major tribes of Oklahoma fought with the Confederacy during the war and were slow to surrender to the Union even after General Robert E. Lee and the rest of the Confederacy soldiers laid down their weapons. Stanhope Uwatai, a Cherokee Confederate brigadier general and commander of the Confederate Indian Cavalry, was the last rebel commander to lay down arms on June 23, 1865. Even after that, the Indian rebels continued to fight for months. Braves raided Union camps in Oklahoma every few weeks, and Indian slaveholders defied federal law and continued to hold African Americans as slaves. Their resistance was born out of their attachment to the institution of slavery and their hatred of the U.S. government. Indians in the southern states began enslaving African Americans as early as the 18th century after they were introduced to the practice by white settlers. For some Indians, such as the Creek and the Pawnee, holding slaves had been a part of their culture before their first contact with Europeans. For the majority, however, their entanglement with slavery began when they became the first victims of it. In the colonies of Georgia, Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama, Indians were held as slaves alongside African Americans. Later, as the practice of enslaving Indians declined in the early 1800s, members of the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Seminole, and Chickasaw tribes began to show up at slave auctions to purchase trafficked African Americans. As they shifted from pelt hunting to farming as their main source of income, plantation slavery became normal in Indian communities. In the 1830s and 40s, Indians were displaced from the South by President Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. Federal troops removed tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw Indians, forcing them to relocate to Oklahoma. They traveled on foot in stagecoaches or on the backs of horses across the Mississippi, taking their slaves with them into the wilderness. At the end of the journey, they reached an undeveloped patch of land that the government called the Indian Territory. The Indians translated the name into Choctaw and called their new home Oklahoma, meaning land of the red people. The area was also home to the thousands of African Americans who made the journey as slaves to the new region. On the journey, migrants battled heat waves and hurricanes. They fought outbreaks of whooping cough, typhus, dysentery, and cholera, all the while being given inadequate rations of food and water by the federal troops who chaperoned their removal from their homelands. The African American slaves who made the journey, sometimes in chains, were assigned the bulk of the manual labor and were often the last to receive a bite of food or a sip of water. As a result, they had the highest mortality rate during the already deadly trip. For the Indians and African Americans who survived the march, it would come to be known among them as the Trail of Tears. 3 decades later, when the Civil War began, the 5 tribes of Oklahoma pledged allegiance to the Confederacy. They joined the rebels to defend their rights as slaveholders and exact revenge on the federal government. During the Civil War, the Confederacy failed to send weapons or reinforcements to Oklahoma. As a result, the Indian rebels in Oklahoma were massacred when they had to do battle with Union fighters. Nonetheless, at the war's end, they refused to surrender. Late in 1865, under threat of an all out war, the leaders of each tribe were summoned to Reconstruction conferences in Arkansas and Washington, D.C., to negotiate their terms of surrender. First, the government demanded that the surrendering tribes sign a peace treaty with the U.S. government. Second, they were to emancipate their slaves and give them tribal rights. Last, they were to cede roughly a quarter of their land as reparations to the federal government for having joined the Confederacy. The terms of the surrender of the Indians in Oklahoma brought jubilation and hope to the African Americans who had been their slaves. Slowly, at the end of 1865, more than 5,000 enslaved African Americans in the territory were set free. Upon emancipation, they began to advocate that the confiscated Indian land be broken up into 40 or 160-acre parcels and given to them to start farms. Some even dreamed that the ceded Indian territory could be turned into an all-black state. All over the country, emancipated African Americans and their allies, the Union Army, and the radical Republicans in Congress advocated that African Americans be given 40 acres of land, perhaps with a mule and a plow. In Oklahoma, the realization of those hopes felt attainable. African Americans dreamed that they could build a promised land on the old Indians' land, a place of their own where they could achieve economic independence as self-employed farmers. In anticipation, hundreds of African American families took up residence in the Indian lands, living in shanty towns made up of old slave quarters and canvas tents. Almost as soon as they had began squatting on the ceded Indian land, bands of Choctaw and Chickasaw Indians with war paint smeared on their cheeks and carrying whips began riding into the encampments on random nights, raiding and pillaging homes. They looted and smashed and dragged black men out of their homes to publicly whip or lynch them as women and children watched. Despite those intimidations, the dreamers of Oklahoma remained, hoping that any day the government would give them the right to petition to be given the land. In 1866, after the Indian tribes of Oklahoma finalized their surrender with the transfer of more than 5 million acres in the center of the Indian Territory to the federal government, African Americans began to petition the Bureau of Land Management for parcels of the land. Under the Homestead Act passed by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, Americans could petition the government for an allotment of publicly held lands. Soon after the first inquiries were received, the Bureau of Land Management rejected them, announcing that the lands had already been earmarked as a resettlement territory for a new group of Indians who were being removed from the Midwest on the Second Trail of Tears. Defeated, some African Americans stayed and fought to be accepted as tribesmen by the Indians who had once held them as slaves. Others left Oklahoma altogether to find their way elsewhere in the emancipated world. There would be no 40 acres for them. There would be no promised land. Not yet. And still not yet. We're still waiting on our 40 acres and the mule. That was chapter 6. We're going to run into chapter 7. BRB. Hey, what's good? Black History Month. We are reading Black Fortunes. We are on chapter 7. Let's get it. Bob Church versus Jim Crow. After he swam to freedom in the Mississippi and emerged on the shore of the Union-occupied town of Memphis, Robert Reed Church was finally a free man, but he also faced starting life over on land. He had a small savings from tips he earned on the boat, but no friends or allies to speak of in town. He decided to seek out his best possible lifeline, his father, Captain Church. He showed up on his father's doorstep, and Captain Church invited him in. They retreated to the parlor, sat together in armchairs, and talked. Captain Church expressed regret for having turned Robert over to the Confederacy. "I had no choice," he told him. Robert forgave the captain, who agreed to do what he could to back him in his endeavors in Memphis, without, of course, openly acknowledging that they were father and son. In his first days as a free man in Memphis, Robert also met a woman named Louisa Lou Ayers. She was a former house slave for a prominent white Memphis family and had remained as a servant with them after the Union forces had arrived. Lou had been provided with an education while she was in their service and could read, write, and speak a few words of French. She was 17 with soft features, skin the color of sand, loosely curled hair, pinned in an updo, and deep-set eyes. She was best known for her laugh, which was lilting and infectious, and charmed everyone she met, including Robert. Robert lacked Lou's formal education and genteel manner. To most who encountered him, he was gruff and Spartan, betraying his upbringing as a riverboat slave. Often he spoke only when spoken to and lapsed into broken English. In social situations, however, he was convivial, telling stories and chatting about current events, channeling the southern charms of his father and the businessmen on his boats. He began to call on Lou often after they met and thought about asking for her hand in marriage. As he was falling in love with her, however, he was nagged by thoughts of his slave wife, Margaret Pico, and their daughter, Laura Church, in New Orleans. In Memphis, there was peace as the colored troops of the Union held control of the city, but elsewhere, the Civil War made much of the South a dangerous battlefront, and there was no way he could get to them. He and Lou were falling for each other. Perhaps, he thought, the best thing to do would be to move on from Margaret. A few months after they met, he asked Lou to be his wife. Robert and Lou married in Memphis in 1863 in front of friends of the family in the yard of a mansion that belonged to the family that owned her. Captain Church attendant and the family that owned Lou purchased her an expensive wedding dress from New York City. A few months after they were married, Lou gave birth to a daughter on September 23, 1863, just months after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. They named her Mary Church, after Captain Church's wife and daughter. After Robert became a father for the second time, he was eager to introduce his daughter to his father. He traveled across town to his father's estate. In Captain Church's parlor, the old ship commander bounced Robert's daughter Mary on his knee. "You've got a good girl here, Bob," he told him. "You have to make sure to raise her right." Captain Church was proud of Robert, even if he did not say it out loud. The two shared a bond that could not be openly spoken of. It would be years before Robert would reveal to his own child that Captain Church, his former owner, was her grandfather. In 1866, after the war ended and African Americans were emancipated, Robert traveled to New Orleans to see Margaret Pico and 7-year-old Laura in New Orleans. When he found his former wife, she was married to another man and had given Laura her new husband's surname, Napier. Robert requested that he be allowed to take Laura to Memphis, where he would pay for her to be put in school. A year later, he sent for Laura and had her brought up to Memphis via steamboat. In Tennessee, she lived with Robert, Lou, and Mary and changed her name to Laura Church. In the months after emancipation, the Union troops stayed in town to keep the peace. The town was full of Confederate luminaries such as Nathan Bedford Forrest and the ex-Confederate President Jefferson Davis, as well as a population of former slaves. Its streets made of wood planks creaked as they were patrolled by a police force made of Confederate veterans. The local government was dominated by rebel sympathizing Democrats. In many towns in the South, including the Memphis Union Brigades, colored troops were left in place to protect the free black population after slavery ended. However, the troops' presence stirred resentment in the ex-Confederates in those towns, who felt they were being occupied by Northern emissaries of the federal government. The Union troops in Memphis were mostly black men, many of them former slaves. During the day, they patrolled the streets and kept order, to the chagrin of many whites in town, especially the police force. At night, the colored troops enjoyed drinking and carousing in parlors and brothels. Robert, who had come of age working in the parlors of Captain Church's ship, saw a business opportunity. With a loan from his wife, who had opened a successful wig shop, he started a billiard hall. In 1866, he applied for a business license, but was denied on the basis of his color. To hell with them, he thought, and set up his business without the paperwork. His billiard hall was a storefront on Gayoso Street, just off 2nd Avenue near the riverfront. Inside, he set up pool tables, a bar stocked with whiskey, and a cash register. In an adjacent room, he built a ballroom where he threw soirees and dances attended by locals, which on occasion devolved into brawls that spilled out into the street. One night, 2 white police officers showed up at Church's billiard hall and arrested him for operating a billiard hall without a license. Robert hired a lawyer, and the case went to trial in April 1866, just days after Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was passed by the Radical Republican caucus in Congress, overriding a presidential veto of Andrew Jackson. It declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens and entitled to equal treatment under the law. On April 17th, the charges against Church were dropped. Confederates in Memphis saw his victory as an affirmation of the Radical Republican Civil Rights Act. He swaggered away from the courtroom a free man, but also a marked one. The events occurred against a backdrop of escalating racial tensions in Memphis, making Church a hero among the blacks and a villain among the ex-Confederate white population. In Memphis, an uneasy peace existed between the races. It was shattered by free black men taking liberty that the ex-Confederates could not stomach, having sex with white women. A riot began with a quarrel between the Memphis police and black Union soldiers outside a brothel by the riverfront, where black Union troops were known to bed white prostitutes. The scrum escalated and several of the Union troops were gunned down. The Memphis police then went on a murderous crawl through the city, shooting black men and white northern carpetbaggers and raping black women. As the riots raged on, word reached Robert that the mob was looking for him. They wanted to kill the black man who had opened a business in spite of the state and then used the Civil Rights Act to get away scot-free. As Robert dressed that day, Lou, pregnant with their second child, begged him to remain home for fear he'd be killed. He slicked his black hair, goatee, and mustache straight with oil and put on his jacket. No, he told her. He was not going to hide. He showed up at the billiard hall and opened shop. He stayed until nightfall, but hardly anyone showed up. Still, he refused to close up. He wasn't hoping to avoid the white mob. He was waiting for them. Never be a coward, Captain Church had taught him. It had just begun to rain when the group of men finally showed up. Get out here, the men standing outside wearing police uniforms and holding guns yelled. David Roach, an Irish police officer, told Robert to close up the hall. Robert went back in the shop, turning his back on the men. He heard the crash of shattering glass as bullets started to ring out. He then heard a pop and felt a burning in the back of his neck. It took him a moment to realize he'd been shot. The men stormed the store as Church lay on the floor, bleeding from the head. They drank from the bottles and barrels of whiskey at the bar. They removed several $100s from the cash register. They broke his pool tables. Finally, they left him for dead and put a torch on the building with him inside. The rain slowed the flames as they engulfed the store, and somehow Robert dragged himself from the burning building. Half dead with a bullet wound in the head, he had escaped possible death for the third time. No one in town heard from Robert in the aftermath of the riots. Was he dead? Had he run? A bipartisan consort of congressmen led by the radical Republican Elihu Washburn arrived in town from Washington, D.C. to conduct an investigation of the riots. They interviewed black Tennesseans, local government officials, and the police officers involved in the riot. Toward the end, a man with a wound on his head came ambling up to speak with the congressman. He introduced himself as Robert Reed Church. "How much of a colored man are you?" Washburn asked. He perhaps was shocked that the rioters had attacked a man who looked so white. "I do not know. Very little. My father was a white man. My mother was as white as I am." Robert told his story of being shot and lying bleeding as the rioters had ransacked his store. He named his assailant as Officer Dave Roach, adding, "He is down at the tavern right now." After the investigation, the federal government opted not to bring any charges as a result of the riots, and most of the policemen kept their jobs. 46 black people were killed. 5 black women raped. 75 people, including Robert, injured. Over 100 were robbed. 91 homes, 12 black schools, and 5 black churches burned. $100,000, about $1.6 million today, of property damage was done. "We have decided this does not merit federal charges," the investigators concluded. In the aftermath of the riot and the government's inaction in dealing with its perpetrators, thousands left Memphis. But thousands more stayed, refusing to give in to mob terror. Among them was Robert Reed Church. As merchants closed their stores and families left their homes, Church began buying real estate. He purchased 5 properties in what was coming to be known as Beale Street District. In 1867, months after having nearly died, Robert became a father again, this time to a son, whom he and Lou named Thomas. With his family and business portfolio growing in Memphis, Robert was resolute about staying and helping to rebuild the city. The Beale Street District was the heart of Black Memphis. After the riots, those in the African American community who remained flowed into the southern tip of Memphis, a district extending from the riverfront for 11 blocks into the city. Its dirt streets held an office of the Freedmen's Bureau, a black church, black rooming houses, brick stores and bars, and wood frame houses. In Beale, the African American communities built a stronghold after the riots, dancing to the music of traveling black brass bands in saloons and dressing in their best clothes to attend church. Following Sunday church service, men still dressed in their suits with gold and silver watch chains hanging from the pockets congregated on corners to socialize, laugh, and make small talk. The throngs of black people on the streets were a constant source of complaint for white women who had to cross through the district to run errands. One Sunday afternoon, Robert was standing on the street corner talking with a group of men. A police officer approached the men and told them to disperse. When they didn't comply, he grabbed Robert by his collar. Robert wrestled free, drew his gun from his hip, and fired a warning shot over the officer's head. The officer then pulled his gun, pistol whipped Church over the head, and dragged him off to jail. Church hired a lawyer and evaded any formal charges. The white rioters had burned Church's billiard hall to the ground the night they had shot him, but in 1870 it was rebuilt. He leased a 2-story brick building on Beale Street. The first floor held a bar in its main room, laid out much like the parlors in his father's ship. The bar was stocked with liquors, fine wines, and expensive cigars. The next room held a billiard hall with new pool tables. And the third room was a barber shop with its own entrance. Outside the building was a watermelon stand where a boy Church employed called out, "Watermelon, watermelon," luring foot traffic toward Church's corner. Over each entrance was a black sign lettered with gold leaf that read, "R.R. Church." One winter, a few years later, it snowed in Memphis for the first time in memory. Snowfall in the Memphis Delta was unexpected, but Robert Church had foreseen such an event and had prepared for the occasion. In the previous year, on a trip up north, he had purchased a sleigh. His friends had made fun of him, thinking he was insane to have brought a sled back to Memphis, a hot, muggy city year-round. Robert predicted that one day it will snow here, and he would have the opportunity to use it. "You'll see," he told them. When the snow finally did come, he affixed it to his horse and rode through town with his young daughter Mary next to him. As they glided through the streets of Memphis, pulled by a galloping steed, they watched as people on the sidewalks and in their yards played in the snow and tossed snowballs at one another. At one point, he was struck by a hail of snowballs and laughed, making it to be good-natured fun. But when he picked up one of the snowballs, he found that it was a rock covered in snow. A larger rock then came hurling at him and hit him in the face. Robert pulled out the revolver he kept at his side and pointed it at the men who had thrown the rock. He let off a shot, and they scattered. Robert drove the sled home. "My father had the most violent temper of any man I ever met," his daughter recalled. Church saloons were a constant center of police activity. On many nights, his bar was the site of brawls, shootings, and stabbings. In the late 1860s, his old friend from the docks, Blanche K. Bruce, walked into his bar. Since emancipation, he had become one of the wealthiest black men in Mississippi, having purchased a large sharecropping plantation there. He was weighing a run for the U.S. Senate and wanted to know what Church, a black man of similar background and status, thought of the idea. If elected, he would be the second ever black senator. Church advised Bruce to run. "I'll support you," he assured him. After Bruce announced his candidacy, he returned to Church's saloon several times to raise money or talk strategy with him. In 1875, he was elected to the Senate from Mississippi. After Bruce's election, and with his own money, celebrity, and political connections, Church became a political power broker, seemingly overnight. Their rough and tumble environment aside, his saloons had served as a de facto headquarters for black political and civil rights activities. Aspiring black politicians would wade through a crowd of gamblers and partiers to talk to him. Local Republicans would often visit his bar to ask for an endorsement or advice. His bargaining political machine was mockingly called De City by white racists who doubled that Church and his friends as black men had the ability to make any political impact. Church and his band of black political mavens would face an uphill battle. In 1877, the remainder of the Union forces in Memphis left the city when the newly elected president, Rutherford B. Hayes, decreed that he was returning the South to home rule. Hayes ordered away the Union troops that had protected blacks and their white Republican allies in the South. Almost immediately, ex-Confederates returned to power as the constituents of an anti-black Democratic Party eager to reverse a decade of racial progress. The summer of 1878 was muggy and hot and beset by swarms of mosquitoes. On the first day of August, a steamboat worker who had slipped out of a yellow fever quarantine in Vicksburg, Mississippi, sat down to eat in a restaurant by the docks operated by a woman called Kate Bionda. He infected Kate, who died just over 2 weeks later, but not before infecting numerous others and beginning a yellow fever outbreak in Memphis. The infection often resulted in the vomiting of blood and the developing of jaundice, which gave the eyes and skin of the infected a yellow hue. It spread quickly and could kill within a few weeks. In Memphis, the epidemic exploded with more than 1,000 infections and 200 deaths within the first few weeks. When Robert heard of the first cases, he rushed home and packed all his children's things into a trunk. He then took Thomas, 11, and Mary, 15, to the train station. At the station, people who were departing were weeping, as were those they abandoned. "You are leaving us poor folks behind," a voice shouted from the crowds. "But you better watch out. Death can find where you are going, just as easy as it can find us here with yellow fever." Church's father also left Memphis during the outbreak. He moved to Monmouth, Arkansas, with his wife and daughter to receive medical treatments for rheumatitis and perhaps escape the possibility of catching the fever. Robert couldn't give too much thought to his father's departure. He was much more concerned with the fate of his children and his loved ones who remained in Memphis. Shortly after arriving in Arkansas, however, Captain Church died of a brain aneurysm. Church barely had time to grieve as the outbreak worsened and the death toll rose. As he walked to his saloon every day, he saw bodies lining the streets. Each day as he worked, he heard funeral bells chime in nearly every hour as deaths mounted to more than 200 a week. Just as blacks had fled Memphis after the race riots, whites fled Memphis in even larger numbers during the outbreak, leaving behind whites without the means to relocate and the majority of the African American population. As the outbreaks wore on, African Americans who were affected with yellow fever died at a lower rate than whites, perhaps due to a resistance developed by African Americans from increased exposure to yellow fever during slavery. One day while he was walking the streets, he lifted up one of the rickety wood planks that was used to pave the roads, as something told him to take a closer look. When he peeled up the rotted wood, he found a pool of filthy, foul-smelling water. He theorized that the unsanitary conditions of the streets had to be responsible for the spread of the sickness. He came to believe that once the streets were paved over, the yellow fever epidemic would subside. The pools of water under the street were indeed the culprit, as they served as the breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which scientists would later learn were the vector for the yellow fever virus. Church followed through on his hunch by buying up houses for pennies on the dollar from families fleeing Memphis and became a large-scale property owner in the city, knowing that if the city rebounded after the fever, he would become rich. He also increased his purchase order for whiskey, which he sold as an antiseptic during the worst days of the plague. In 1879, when the epidemic began to abate, the city of Memphis emerged bankrupt. After years of people and businesses fleeing, the city was out of money. In order to pay down its debts, the local government issued bonds. The first bond was sold for $1,000, roughly $27,092 now, to Robert Reed Church. To the surprise of many, Memphis's most hated black citizen was the first to step up to try to save the city. After his bond purchase, other prominent local businessmen and families followed suit. Church's actions helped Memphis survive the outbreak and rebuild after it, garnering him goodwill from Memphis's white citizens and solidifying his reputation as the city's most prominent black son. Meanwhile, the money from the bonds were used to rebuild Memphis, and as one of the city's largest property owners, Church stood to make a hefty sum from the redevelopment. And that was chapter 7. We will be back for chapter 8. Peace.